Are you feeling better, brother? Yeah. No. Well, I'll grab it if I do. So, just in case. Old legs. So on week 4, you can turn me down a little bit, Aubrey. So week 4, we're going to be talking about God is with us this week. John did a great job last week talking about Abraham. And so we've used that little acronym, beep slowly, Jake carries Coco, right? So beep slowly, Jake carries Coco. Memorize that, and then you'll have a good reference point for the history of Israel, and it's so easy to use. So B stands for what? Beginnings, right? Beginnings. So beginnings was creation. What else was it? Cain and Abel. No, not Abraham. Yeah, patriarchs. Noah and the flood, right? The sin expanded. It began to go out. What else? Tower of Babel, right? They refused to go out and multiply. They were staying together instead of obeying God. So the Tower of Babel, Noah and the flood, Cain and Abel, the fall, Adam and Eve's sin. Sin comes into the world and creation. So that's beginnings, right? So that's the beginning. It's the stage setter and what's happening. And so that's the start. God created us to have a relationship with us, but that relationship was broken. And then we've seen sin to start to spread. And so then God begins to work out his plan, and that goes to P. What does P stand for? Patriarchs, right? The patriarchs. And John started with Abraham last week and talked about him. And then Abraham and Sarah is a part of that, but always the men are looked at as the patriarchs. And then Isaac and Jacob are the next. We're going to take a look at Isaac and Jacob tonight. Also, we're going to throw in Joseph. Generally, when the patriarchs are talked about, usually it's Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That's how it's usually looked at. But Stephen, when Stephen was given his witness at the stoning, when he was stoned, he also talked about the rest of the tribe of Jacob as being the patriarchs. And so these are the foundational, this is the start of Israel, the foundation that God is laying. And so, and where the nation of Israel comes from. And it's the beginning of God choosing a people to be his vessel, to be where he's going to start his plan from, and to bring salvation and restoration into the world. So this is the starting point. And that's why it's so important to understand that. So you had the creation, the relationship broken, and now you have the plan, the foundation being laid through the patriarchs. When we look at the book of the Bible, it is full, and as you guys have been reading, messy people, right? I mean, this Bible, this is one of the reasons why you would think if somebody's writing a book and it's going to talk about God, everything is going to be, it's all about perfect, being perfect, but it's not. It's full of messiness. God's people, this chosen people, the patriarchs, the one that he's laying the foundation through, they're messy. It's a bunch of messy lives, a lot of brokenness, a lot of things that got to be worked through. So just share with me some of the relationships that you have seen up to this point, not beyond this point, but up to what you've read so far that are so messy. So what are some of the scenes, the moments that are messy? Abraham, what about Abraham specifically? Okay, so there was that moment where he talked about his wife being a sister, right? So that was a little messy, huh? Ishmael, Abraham ended up having that relationship, had sex and had a baby, and made a baby through the servant, right? Sarah and Hagar, the jealousy, right? The jealousy and favoritism within that. What else? Moses got drunk. Noah, that was Noah. Noah got drunk. I do that all the time. That's probably me throwing. Yeah, so Noah got drunk. Good. He got drunk, and his son Ham came in, and there was a situation, and then Canaan was cursed because of that, right? So what'd you say? Cain and Abel, jealousy and murder, right? Brother murdered. What else? We're just scratching the surface, right? That's what's crazy, right? I mean, you got Lot, who offers his daughters to the crowd that wanted to rape, the visitors, and instead of protecting his own daughters, he offers his daughters out to them, right? What else? Anybody else got anything? What about, we're talking about Isaac and Rebekah. Don't they play favorites between their sons, right? They play favorites, and Jacob, he marries 2 wives, ends up marrying 2 wives, and that whole situation between Laban and how he's deceived and all of that to get to that situation. So what we're seeing is, in this situation, we're seeing a lot of mess, relational mess, a lot of brokenness, a lot of jealousy. Sin is in the middle of this, right? Sin is in the middle of this. And again, the Bible's full of real people. And as we begin to read these stories, as we're reading through these pages, we're reading about real people. It's not just make-believe people. It's not just made-up people. These are real people just like us. They existed. They walked on this earth. They had lives, and they had to make choices. And they lived in a world that they didn't quite understand a lot. There was a lot going on. They didn't have what we have, right, in making the choices. This stuff wasn't written yet. So they didn't have any of it. And so they're just real people. They're not perfect heroes, right? They're not perfect heroes. Again, these are important key people in the history of Israel and for us, just as the apostles were. The apostles were important people, in planning the church and building the church. But you know what? They weren't perfect either, right? When we look through the scriptures, read through this book, we see that they weren't perfect. They weren't even the best of the best, right? I mean, that's why they weren't even following rabbis, because they weren't even the brightest and the smartest and the top of the class. So they weren't perfect in any way either. And even though they're not perfect, God loves them all. And when we see in these pages, God has moments of grace and forgiveness. He has moments of teaching, working through things. Yes, he holds them accountable in their choices, and they pay consequences. And he doesn't always rescue them most of the time doesn't rescue them from those consequences, and other people pay consequences because of their choices. And so, and we see that they're not perfect, and neither are we, and God loves us too, right? None of us are perfect. I'm not perfect. You're not perfect. And to walk in, as we do life together, as we do life in this world, as we do life together, we're going to, we're not going to see things eye to eye, but we're also not perfect. We got to give each other grace just as God gives us grace, right? When we're doing life together. And so none of us are perfect. And here's the thing is God is the star. He's the actual hero of the story, right? I think sometimes, and especially Israel lifted these patriarchs up as heroes. I mean, they had when you talked about them, I mean, these were special guys, and they are. But they're not the heroes of the story, right? And for us, the apostles and Apostle Paul, I mean, it's amazing what Paul did and the impact Paul had. But, he's a hero. I mean, he is a hero. I mean, he did great things. I mean, Hebrews talks about these guys as heroes and all that, but they're not the hero, right? Only God is the hero. He's the hero of the story. And we need to realize that he's the story. Last week, John talked about Abraham and the covenant that he made with Abraham, and that was the start. So he made this covenant, and what God is doing is he's beginning to build, like I said earlier, the foundation, right? He's building the foundation. He's carrying out his plan. God hasn't stopped carrying out his plan either. And he's continuing to do his plan even today. So, just because this stuff was all happening back then doesn't mean it's not happening today. He's still carrying out his plan. He's still working. He's still moving. He's still building the church, and he's still in control. And again, he's the hero. And the question maybe come up, maybe some of you, or you've heard it asked, but if God's the hero, then why does bad stuff happen, right? I mean, what is all this bad stuff happening? Where is God when, right? I mean, that's the question people ask a lot. I mean, where is God when my parents get cancer? Where is God when my brother lost his son? Where was God then, right? Where was God in the middle of that? And the problem is when we're asking those questions and when the people are asking those questions, we're looking at the wrong thing, okay? We need to realize we're not looking at the right thing. We're looking at the consequence of sin. And that's what we're seeing. Now, for people that don't know God and don't have a relationship with God, it's harder for them to see this, but we need to see this as Christians. We need to understand this, and we need to put our focus on the right thing, not the consequences of sin. We have to realize that our focus needs to change, and we need to put our focus on the right thing. And here's the thing, is if we would obey God, right? John and I were talking about this week. If we were to obey God and do everything that he says in here, we wouldn't have the problems that we have, right? Seriously. I mean, if we followed this and humbled ourselves and did what this tells us to do, then we wouldn't have the problems that we have. I mean, we're going to talk about in next month is family. I mean, taking care of your family. God talks about how we're responsible for taking care of our family and what that looks like. If we do that, then we won't have the problems that we have. If we work that out, if we forgive and love and encourage, I mean, this place is a different world. If we do this seriously, you can argue with we can talk about it, but look at this and the way God lays things out. I mean, there's a year of jubilee, so everybody would be forgiven and debt is forgiven, so that everybody can start again anew and fresh. Imagine your debt being forgiven. If we live like that and treat each other with respect and all of that, this world will be different. So what we have to do is change our focus, not focus on the consequences of sin. Yeah. Yeah, and saying that back then, it was still hard. But if we lived it out the way God meant for us to live it out without sin and greed and all of that staying a part of it, it would be different. Oh, right. No. So it's they didn't have it easier. They still, being poor then, we think poor is one thing here, but we have no clue what being poor is. In this nation especially. Go to Mexico, go to Peru, go to a third world country, you'll see poor, what poor looks like. Anyway, so we have to change our focus. If we obey God, like I said, we wouldn't have the problems. God says in the Bible, he gives us everything that we need. He says that in here. So 2 Peter 1, 3-9 says this. His divine power has given us everything what? We need for a godly life through our knowledge of him who called us by his own glory and goodness. Through these, he has given us his very great and precious promises, so that through them you may participate in the divine nature, having escaped the corruption in the world caused by evil desires. For this very reason, make every effort to add to your faith goodness, and to goodness knowledge, and to knowledge, self-control, and to self-control, perseverance, and to perseverance, godliness, and to godliness, mutual affection, and to mutual affection, love. For if you possess these qualities in increasing measure, they will keep you from being ineffective and unproductive in your knowledge of our Lord Jesus Christ. And Peter tells us that we have everything we need, to live for God and to make an impact in this world, to be productive. And we need to get our focus on that, get our focus on God, get our focus on his word and who he is and his character, and to live this out. And so this is kind of an overview of where we're going. It's not that God isn't concerned about the big things. It's not that he's not concerned about the big things. He's concerned about world poverty. He's concerned about the devastations that are going on in this world. He's concerned about the diseases that are in this world. He's concerned about the wars that are in this world, right? Again, those things that are happening are the consequences of sin. They're the consequences of greed and power and all of that stuff. That's not about love. That's not about, that's not the center of those things. What God is truly concerned about is the hearts of people. What God wants us to focus on is people. Because when people change, when our hearts change, when our lives change, then those things change, right? When we get our hearts right for God, when we do the things that we're supposed to be doing, and we start making a difference and start living differently, and that starts to spread, then those things change, right? So you can't just, I know people are like, well, what about this? What about this? You can't change those things in an instant. It has to start with people. And that's where God starts with. God starts with people. His focus on people. And the thing is God has shown us the end of the story. You know, we see the end of the story. We see how this is all going to play out. I mean, and we realize that even with all of this, you know, the world is going to end, right? We're going to see wars and devastation and diseases and all of that. You know, God says that's going to happen. But we have a responsibility to save people's lives. And the kingdom of God is beyond this world. And our eyes have to get off of this world and get on a different kingdom, get our eyes on the right place, right? And that's where Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob's eyes are. Right? He made a covenant with them. He started a promise with them. He started this putting into motion these guys' lives and beginning changing people's hearts and changing the world through these men and these families. And so Hebrews chapter 11, 8 through 10 says this. It says, by faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed, big word, right? Obeyed and went. Even though he did not know where he was going, he believed and had faith in God. By faith, he made his home in the promised land, like a stranger in a foreign country. He wasn't thinking about then. He was looking at the promise that God had. He had faith that God was going to do what he promised. Like a stranger in a foreign country, he lived in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him of this same promise, right? For he was looking forward to a city with foundations whose architect and builder are God. Isn't that where you want to live, right? In his house. Yeah. And so they were looking ahead. They were having faith in God. And these guys, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, they were nomads. I mean, they didn't have a home that was there. I mean, again, they were looking forward, right? So these guys moved, and they moved from land to land, place to place. Sometimes in the process of doing that, they encountered other people who lived in the land, and they had skirmishes and disputes and things that they had to work out with those people. And so they moved from their tents from place to place, eventually settling down in certain areas for some time, but they constantly moved. And they trusted God, that God was guiding and leading and directing them. Again, Israel at this point isn't Israel yet, right? This isn't Israel yet. It's just the beginning. And we're going to get into that where Israel does become Israel. So this is the beginning. And then we have to remember that this isn't our home either, right? So they realize that this isn't their home, and then the picture of what they were getting, and we have to realize that this isn't our home. And we have to put our eyes on something beyond what we see here. So we got to get our vision in the right place, just as these guys' vision was in the right place. So God helps show us the way through small stuff, through the mistakes of those who went before us. So we're talking about these guys, right, and what God's using them. But as we read their stories, they're not perfect, right? So there's a lot of growing that has to do in these guys. And God begins to teach them just as he does with us, right? He grows us and teaches us and matures us. So here's the first thing. God was with Isaac. So God is with Isaac. Abraham shows his faith in God by being with him for the sake of the bigger picture and the smaller details. We see this in the beginning of Genesis 24. Genesis 24, 1 through 9 says this. Abraham was now very old, and then the Lord had blessed him in every way. He said to the senior servant in his household, the one in charge of all that he had, "Put your hand under my thigh. I want you to swear by the Lord, the God of heaven and the God of earth," that's a covenant, that you will not get a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites, among whom I am living, but will go to my country and my own relatives and get a wife for my son Isaac. The servant asked him, "What if the woman is unwilling to come back with me to this land? Shall I then take your son back to the country you came from?" "Make sure that you do not take my son back there," Abraham said. Right? I'm going to stop here for a minute. So, number one, Abraham is not wanting his son to marry anyone in Canaan. Right? He's the gods that they worship. He doesn't want them to infiltrate his son and influence his son. Second, don't take my son back there. Abraham left that place. He's going in a new direction. He doesn't want his son to go back there, right? He wants him to keep moving forward with what God is promising, what God is doing. Okay, go ahead. "The Lord, the God of heaven, who brought me out of my father's household and my native land, and who spoke to me and promised me an oath, saying, 'To your offspring I will give you this land. And he will send his angel before you so that you can get a wife for my son from there. If the woman is unwilling to come back with you, then you will be released from this oath of mine. Only do not take my son back there.' So the servant put his hand under the thigh of his master Abraham and swore an oath to him concerning this matter." All right, so this is incredible faith, right? Now we're seeing Abraham grow. We're seeing Abraham's faith grow. He knows that God will provide, right? He knows that God will provide in this situation. And so he's trusting that God will provide. That's Jehovah what? Jireh, right? We've been talking about that. God who provides. God constantly provides. He provides for our needs. Here's the thing is, this is a small thing, right? I mean, it's a marriage. It's a big thing, but in the grand scope of things, in the grand scheme of things, really, I mean, this is one married couple in the whole big world. Of all the people that in the world, one couple. But this one couple, it's big. This is a big moment, right? And so God is providing to fulfill the promise given by God in His covenant. He's going to fulfill that promise. And again, Abraham shows incredible faith here in God and his trust in God. Now, Abraham's prayer is the first prayer recorded in the Bible, when he prays for Sodom and Gomorrah. And really that's pray when he's there with God and he's asking and he's pleading for Sodom and Gomorrah, for people's lives to be spared. And that's the first prayer that we see. The second prayer is recorded right here in Genesis chapter 24, 12, in the midst of this. And in the midst of this, as Abraham's servant goes to Abraham's land, he finds the land, and he begins to pray for God to provide this woman. And as he is praying for this woman, guess what happens? She shows up, right? Rebecca shows up, and she comes, and she does all the things that he asked. And so God provides in this moment. And here's the response of the servant, right? So we're seeing Abraham's faith. We see the impact of Abraham's faith on his servant. We're seeing Abraham's faith, the way Abraham's living his life and how it's impacting the people's lives around them. This servant is faithful to God and to Abraham, right? He sees Abraham's faith. He turns to God. We're seeing this influence, this impact, right? Right here. And then watch the servant's response. Genesis chapter 24, verse 26 and 27. Then the man bowed down and worshiped the Lord, saying, Praise be to the Lord, the God of my master Abraham, who has not abandoned his kindness and faithfulness to my master. As for me, the Lord has led me on the journey to the house of my master's relatives. I mean, he just praises God, right? He falls down and worships and praises God. And we see this impact of Abraham's life and the influence. From there, we see a series of incredible faithful decisions and obedience to God's call, especially by Rebekah. We see these faithful choices, and then when Rebekah is asked if she will go, she says, I will go. And she takes a step of faith. I mean, can you imagine that? Not knowing, and all of a sudden somebody's showing up and saying that they want you to be the bride of his master's son, and she says, I'll go, I will trust God, and so she does. And then we see Isaac's decision, his decision of faith, as his dad has got a bride for him. And let's look at Isaac's decision. Genesis chapter 24, verses 62 and 66. It says, Now Isaac had come from Beer Lahai Roi, for he was living in Negev. He went out to the field one evening to meditate. And again, what's he doing? He's meditating, right? He's spending time with God. And as he looked up, he saw camels approaching. Rebekah also looked up and saw Isaac. And she got down from her camel and asked the servant, Who is that man in the field coming to meet us? He is my master, the servant answered. So she took her veil and covered herself. Then the servant told Isaac all that he had done. And he told Isaac all he had done. I thought I had more there. But Isaac trusts in God. He takes a step of faith. He marries Rebekah, and they began starting a family. And again, we see a series of trust-filled steps. Again, the picture of the entire world, this seems little. But this wedding, this marriage, but this is really big. And even though it's little, God is in the details. He's in the details of this moment. He cares about the big stuff, but he knows that the small stuff, the little stuff, the hearts of people, this is where change really happens. This is where the foundation is built. And when we build this foundation, again, he will be able to do incredible things to the people who trust in him and have faith in him. And so we go on and we see God give his promise to Isaac with Abraham. That's in Genesis chapter 26, 2 through 6. So the same promise that God gave to Abraham, he gives to Isaac. And he passes that covenant, that promise to Isaac. Let's see, where am I at here? Skip something. So we go on and we see the promise that gives it. So Isaac stays in Gerar, and then he makes the same misstep his father made. So again, we see that Isaac's not perfect. And so the misstep that Abraham made twice, right, saying that his wife, Sarah, was a sister, Isaac does the very same mistake. And when they ask about Rebekah, he says, now she's my sister, and he makes the same mistake as his father did. But Isaac learns his lesson, and he goes on to show incredible faith in God. Again, roaming the land and trusting in God, moving because of disputes. And as Isaac is moving along the land and they're moving, he's running into people who are saying, he's digging wells. That once they clogged up all the wells. And so they get on him, he moves somewhere else. He digs a new well. They dispute and say, hey, that's my well. And so instead of Isaac creating problems, he works with the people that he's working with. He moves about. And he finally gets to a place where he can start kind of settling down a little bit. And he begins to do that. And then God begins to provide for him and begins to build his family, begins to build the nation through that. Genesis chapter 26, verses 24 through 25. This is what the people saw. The night the Lord appeared to him and said, I am the God of your father Abraham. Do not be afraid, for I am with you. I will bless you, and I will increase your number of your descendants for the sake of my servant Abraham. Isaac built an altar there and called on the name of the Lord. There he pitched his tent, and there his servants dug a well. And so God reminds him of the promise. And God says, I'm with you. I'm with you. I'm here with you. I'm walking through this with you. And it says that the nations around were afraid, and they saw the impact God was having on Isaac and Isaac's faith and how his family and how this nation was beginning to grow. These people were beginning to grow. And so during this time is when Isaac and Rebekah have twins, Jacob and Esau. But it took prayer because Rebekah, like Sarah, was barren. She wasn't able to have babies, but it took prayer, and she prayed to God, and God blessed Isaac and Rebekah with twins. The boys wrestled within Rebekah's womb, and so you guys have been reading the story, right? They wrestled within Rebekah's womb, and Rebekah, like any mom-to-be, especially if they'd been barren. I've had friends who were barren and they hadn't been able to have kids. And when they finally get pregnant, it's stressful, right? You're worried about every little thing. And as Rebekah feels the twins wrestling within her stomach, she begins to cry out to God. And she's confused, and she asks God, and God comes to her, and he comforts her, and he lets her know. He lets her know, he says, there's 2 nations within your womb. You imagine hearing that, right? There's 2 nations within your womb, and they're wrestling, right? And these 2 nations are wrestling in your womb, and the older will serve the younger. And so God gives her a promise and gives her a vision of what's to come. And Esau was the oldest. He was the one that was born first. He came out of the womb, and Jacob was holding on to Esau's heel, the heel of his foot as he was coming out, right? And see, he was holding on, and so they were wrestling even as they came out of the womb. And so Esau has the birthright because he's the firstborn between these two. And now this is where the birthright really begins to take shape as we get into this. Again, this is happening before Moses and the law. We have to understand that this isn't law yet. This stuff will be law. When we get into going through the law, these things are going to come up as you're reading through that. But these things will be a part of the law, but they're not a part of the law yet. This is something that's happening then. And there's really no evidence of this birthright in history. I did a real strong search in history, and there's no evidence outside of what was happening here for this to be taking place. And so there's been some distance between Noah and Abraham. There's been generations, like we talked about the first week. Other gods were being worshiped during this time. Those other gods were influencing the nations around them, but also within Abraham and Israel, within these boundaries, we'll see parts of this being in play in here. So this hasn't really become a part of what anything else up to this point. So the birthright has begun to take shape. So the one true God calls Abraham. Much of the culture influenced beliefs, actions, and God is teaching, and he's leading, and he's beginning to build a foundation through Abraham, through Isaac, through Jacob, and he's beginning to build these things and to put into place things that are going to come out in the future and what he's doing. And so we're starting to see some of this stuff take shape. Again, like this is the first place we see this. Abraham's only son with Sarah was Isaac, right? The only true son. So when you look at the story, he gets everything. When you read the story, Isaac gets everything. Ishmael is actually Abraham's first oldest son, but because he's born to a slave, and this comes out in the law later, he doesn't get the birthright. He can be skipped with the birthright, but we do know that God blesses Ishmael. He does get blessed. And he goes on to become a great nation in and of himself. And then Isaac is the true son of him and Sarah, and so he's the only son between him and Sarah, so he gets everything. But we also have to understand when Sarah dies, Abraham has children with his concubine, and he has several other children. And after Sarah, this doesn't happen until after Sarah dies. And so he has other children. And he gives all of those children some inheritance, some money, and to take care of them. But then what he does is he drives them away. He tells them to leave. And he sends all of them away. And so everything is given to Isaac. And so now that Jacob and Esau are together, there's two. So what do you do at this point? What happens at this point with the two? Of the birth, I skipped a page. Oh, here we go. I put 2 pages. So there's 2 sons. So what do we do with that? So here's the birthright. I'm going to talk about the birthright and the blessing. They're 2 different things. The birthright and the blessing are 2 different things. The birthright went to the oldest son. So the oldest son would normally get the birthright. It doesn't always mean that he would, but generally the birthright was to the oldest son, and that's where it went. And what that meant was that he got double portion of what the father owned. So he would get double of what the other kids would. So Jacob's going to be the one that's going to get this birthright. And so he's actually going to get double portion of what Esau would get. Even though we'll talk about him not being the oldest, but he's going to end up giving double portion. So whoever has the birthright gets double portion of all his father owned. He also took the physical leadership of the father's family. He would become the leader of the family. He would also become the spiritual leader of the family. And he also got the greater blessing. Now, blessings were given, a blessing could be given to all the kids, but there's a greater blessing. And usually the firstborn would get that greater blessing. And then the rest of the kids would get lesser blessings, right? And so a blessing wasn't just given to the oldest, it was given to all the kids in the family generally. So rest, I said that, rest of it. So then there's also within that, there may be curses that are given too. So now the oldest doesn't always get the birthright and the greater blessing. Other factors determine who gets that blessing. Now, if there's a sin, if something happens, let's say the oldest son sins, so the next son would get the blessing. They could pass that blessing on and the birthright to the next son, and we're going to see that happen in some of the stories as we go on. And so some other factors may determine who gets the birthright and the blessing. But generally, the oldest son is the one that gets it, gets the birthright and the blessing, and he becomes the leader of the family. So again, there's 2. So Jacob has 2 sons, or Isaac has 2 sons, Jacob and Esau. Right, we'll talk about let's jump to Jacob's kids, okay? Let's jump to Jacob's kids. So Jacob has 12 kids, right? So Jacob has 12. Well, so the oldest was Reuben. Reuben was the firstborn. And then there was Simeon, and then there was Levi, and there was Judah in the line. Those were Leah's kids. So Reuben would have been the oldest, so he was the one that was in line for the birthright and the blessing. But what happened was Reuben sinned. Reuben slept with one of Jacob's concubines, and so one of the slaves. So because of that sin, because he sinned, he didn't get the blessing, and so the blessing went from him. So then it would go down to Simeon, right? And so Simeon and Levi, what happened was their sister Dinah was taken advantage of, and she was raped. And so they went to get honor for their daughter, and they attacked, but they did that without the blessing of Isaac, or it wasn't the blessing of Jacob. And so because of that, they didn't get the blessing. So then that birthright fell to Judah. And Judah doesn't get all of the blessing, but he gets the blessing of leadership, and he gets part of the blessing of he gets the birthright of leadership, and he gets part of the blessing of the covenant. And then from Judah, we get Jesus comes through the line of Judah. And so, but he is the one that gets that. But also, what happens is, and this kind of gets a little messy, but Joseph's sons end up getting, Joseph and his sons end up getting part of the blessings as well in the end. But so, is that as clear as mud, right? Isn't that? Go ahead. Mm-hmm. Yes, and we're going to talk about that. Yeah. Who? Esau? Right. So we're going to talk about that here in a second. So trying to understand this birthright and blessing. So the oldest generally gets it, and he gets the birthright and all of the stuff that comes with it and the blessing. But it doesn't always happen that way. We just have to understand that. It just doesn't always work out that way, but that's the way that it's supposed to. And in the law, we're going to see it kind of come into place. There, God puts it in the law, but then there's, things in there that changes that. So some of this stuff works itself into the law. But here we go to Jacob and Esau. So Jacob and Esau, again, he told Rebekah what was going to happen, right? Jacob wants the birthright. And these guys have been wrestling. And so when Esau comes in from his hunting trip and he's famished, he's hungry, Jacob lays he lays down and says, I'll give you this soup. Esau wants to eat, he's hungry. He goes, I'll give you this soup for the birthright, for your birthright. And Esau agrees to it. And he gives Jacob his birthright. He gives up his birthright, and he treats it so casually, right? He treats this blessing or this birthright so casually. And he just takes it casually. He gives it to Jacob. And so Jacob gets the birthright. But in his mind, Esau is he's still thinking, because he knows the birthright and the blessing are different. And he's thinking, I still have the blessing. I don't have the birthright. Jacob's, I can care about that, whatever. But I still have the blessing. Now, we know in the New Testament, this is talked about as not taking casually the birthright, not taking casually the blessing. So what has to happen is Jacob wants the blessing as well. He not only does he want the birthright, he also wants the blessing of God. And so they begin, him and Rebekah, and then you got to understand Rebekah's family here. They began to, Jacob's name means to deceive. It means deceit. It means, he's the one that's pursuing. He's always pursuing. And this is a part of his, it's kind of his character. A lot of their names came from their character. But Rebekah comes from a home that's already like that. And so we're going to learn from her brother, Laban, that this is a part of their lifestyle. So she's already used to this. And so her and Jacob began devising a plan for him to get the birthright, or to get the blessing. And so as Isaac is about ready to give the blessing, they begin to deceive Isaac. And so Jacob goes in. He gets the blessing from Isaac. And now he has both the birthright and the blessing. And Esau comes in, and he's expecting to get the blessing, but he doesn't. And Isaac has taken the blessing from him. And so we see in Esau's words, when you see some of the words he says, he goes, not only has he stolen, this brother of mine, this deceiver, has stolen my birthright, he has also stolen my blessing, the blessing that I'm supposed to get. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, she knows that and they got favorite. The other thing you have to understand is that Rebekah's favorite is Jacob. Isaac's favorite is Esau. So they got favorites. And God had also pointed out, again, remembering what God had said to her, she knows what's happening. And so they go into the process. And so Esau's mad. He decides he's going to kill Jacob. He wants to kill Jacob. Rebekah gets wind of this. She tells Jacob. And she doesn't want Jacob. Now, Esau's married some Canaanite women, 2 Canaanite women. He has 2 wives. And it says in the Bible that these guys were like a thorn in Isaac and Rebekah's side. They couldn't stand these 2 wives. It was driving them crazy. But she didn't want Jacob to marry Canaanite women. So in order to protect Jacob, she sends Jacob off, and she sends Jacob to her homeland to go be with her brother Laban. And so Jacob makes the journey and begins going on a journey. Again, this is messy, but he travels to his mother's homeland and his father's homeland, and he begins to go there and to look for a bride. And so the next part of the thing is God is with Jacob. And so not only was God with Abraham, God was with Isaac, and we're going to learn that God is with Jacob. Now Jacob, again, name means deceiver, right? This is kind of where he's at and what he's doing. And so on his journey to his family's place, Jacob sleeps. He finds a place to sleep. And he begins to have a dream. And this is the dream, we call it Jacob's ladder. And when he's dreaming, he has a vision. And in his vision, he sees a ladder, a stairway going from the earth to the heavens. And as he sees the stairway, he sees angels going back and forth, up and down this stairway. And so seeing this, he sees that God is involved. We see that God is involved with the things of this earth. And we see not only is God transcendent, not only is he over everything, but he also see that he's involved in everything that's happening in this world, that he is a part of what's happening in people's lives. And we see this in this picture, that God is with Abraham, God is with Isaac, and God is with Jacob. And that's what he says, Genesis chapter 28, verses 13 through 22. And this is what happens. There above it stood the Lord, and he said at the top of the stairs, he said, I am the Lord, the God of your father Abraham, the God of Isaac. I will give you and your descendants the land on which you are lying. Your descendants will be like the dust of the earth, and you will spread out to the west and to the east and to the north and to the south. All peoples on earth will be blessed through you and your offspring. I am with you and will watch over you. Wherever you go, I will bring you back to this land. I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. When Jacob awoke from his sleep, he thought, surely the Lord is in this place, and I was not aware of it. Now, this is starting to see where Jacob is, right? We see Jacob's he's not aware of it. I mean, there's still some things that he's missing. It says he was afraid and said, how awesome is this place? This is none other than the house of God. This is the gate of heaven. This is the gate of heaven. Early the next morning, Jacob took the stone he had placed under his head, and he set it up as a pillar and poured oil on top of it. He called the place Bethel, though the city used to be called Luz. Then Jacob made a vow, saying, if God will be with me. Now think about the words that are being said here, okay? If God will be with me and will watch over me on this journey I'm taking, and will give me food to eat and clothes to wear, so that I return safely to my father's household, then the Lord will be my God. Right? He said, and this stone that I have set up as a pillar will be God's house, and of all that you give me, I will give you a tenth. I will give you a tenth. And we can kind of see a little bit of Jacob's heart here, right? He said, if you do this, and then, I will believe. So we kind of see he's not quite there yet. He's still wrestling with the world. He's still wrestling with his place. He's still, when we look at him taking the rights of the firstborn and the blessing, his heart may not be quite in the right place still. And when he's doing this. And so there's some learning and some growing that has to do, and God is working on Jacob's heart. He's going to teach him some things. So there's some strings attached to his words. There's some strings attached to Jacob's words. He goes ahead to his family's land, and he finds the bride that he wants to marry, right? He finds and falls in love with Rachel. And she's the one that he wants, right? And she has a sister named Leah. And so it's a crazy story. But Jacob strikes a deal with Laban that he'll work for him for 7 years, and at the end of 7 years, that he would get Rachel as his wife. And so he does that, and then Laban, here's Laban, here's the trickster. This is where the deception starts, right? Rebecca, this is a family. And so Laban tricks Jacob into marrying Leah. And so when they have the wedding, he goes into the tent. He's waiting for Rachel to come into the tent for them to consummate their marriage. And what Laban does is he sends in his oldest daughter. So Leah's the oldest, Rachel's the youngest. So Jacob thinks he's getting the youngest. But then Leah comes in. And it says that he sleeps with her, consummates the marriage, and then wakes up in the morning and he says in the story, oh, it's Leah, right? So, yeah, yeah. So, and so he knows he's been tricked, and he goes out and confronts Laban, and Laban says, well, our custom is you have to have the youngest can't marry until the oldest. And so he tricks Jacob, and he says, what I'll do is I'll give you, if you stay with Leah for the time that you're supposed to, I will give you Rachel, and she will become your wife as well. And then you have to work another 7 years. And so they work out this deal. And but also we're seeing a picture here, right? We see as Jacob is stealing the birthright and the blessing, it's coming back, right? And he's thinking he's going to take the youngest, but the oldest comes. And so we see God is doing something. He's teaching Jacob in the middle of this. He's teaching him something, and Jacob needs to learn. And he does. He begins to learn this. He begins to see this. And so they go on. He's doing life with them. They stay there a little longer. And so as he's doing that, he begins to deceive Laban. And he begins to do something with his sheep. You guys read the story. And he ends up taking a whole bunch of great sheep and his family. And then he has to run. He realizes he has to take off. And so in the middle of the day, and he sneaks out, him and his family, and they take off going back home. And so as he's going, Laban begins to pursue Jacob and his family. And so God shows up in a dream to Laban and tells Laban not to harm Jacob. Laban shares his dream with Jacob, further showing Jacob that God is with him. Right? And so as Laban shares this story with Jacob, Jacob is hearing how God intervened. As Laban's pursuing, God is providing, God is with Jacob, just as he was with Abraham, just as he was with Isaac, and Jacob is starting to learn. He's starting to learn. He's starting to grow. Now, one of the things we have to understand is that Rachel took some of the family idols with her. And so she took them, and she was hiding them from Laban. And so these idols are still influenced, still involved in this household, still a part. And Jacob is still a part of that. You know what I mean? So some of this is still in Jacob's heart. It's still there. He's still not where he needs to be, like Isaac was and like Abraham. And so Jacob makes the final push home. He has more obstacles that he has to face, and that is his brother Esau. And so as he's beginning to go home, he realizes he needs to face Esau, and that's the next step that he's got to face. Something's happening to Jacob. He's changing, he's growing, he's learning, but he's not quite there. And then we see in the story, this journey of maturity, and it's the same things that we see in our lives, guys. We are on this journey. We don't start out mature, right? We don't start out in this process. I think Jacob, this is a perfect story, is when we come to God, we don't quite understand everything. We say yes to God. We say yes, and we take that step of faith, but we don't fully understand what that means. And as we begin going on this journey, we learn and we grow and we become more mature and more wise. And we start to understand when we are truly being led and taught by God. We begin to learn. And God was doing that on this journey with Jacob. And we share in that same journey. So Jacob begins to trust God, but he still, he takes a step of faith and takes a step of trust. And he begins to plan on to meet Esau. And so he starts sending, he sends his servant ahead to go meet with Esau to take some gifts. And what happens, the servant goes to Esau saying, hey, Jacob is coming. He's going to come and meet up with you. And then the servant comes back and says, you know what? Esau's coming to see you. So Esau's coming to you. And then Jacob, he has another moment of freak out, right? And so he's like, oh, no. What in the world's going to happen? So he starts freaking out. So he instead of, again, here's a little bit, instead of completely trusting in God, he took a step of faith to trust God, but now he's kind of reverting a little bit back. He gets a little scared. He divides his people, and he divides them up. So if Esau attacks some of them will survive. And then not only that, he begins to send, this is where he sends off some bribe towards Esau. And then what happens is God he has this real epic moment. There's this epic moment in Genesis chapter 32, and let's read that. So chapter 32, verses 22 through 30. That night Jacob got up and took his 2 wives, his 2 female servants, and his 11 sons and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. After he had sent them across the stream, he sent over all his possessions. So Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him till daybreak. When the man saw that he could not overpower him, he touched the socket of Jacob's hip, so that his hip was wrenched as he wrestled with the man. Then the man said, let me go, for it is daybreak. But Jacob replied, I will not let you go unless you bless me. The man asked him, what is your name? Jacob, he answered. Then the man said, your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with who? God, and with humans, and have overcome. Jacob said, please tell me your name. But he replied, why do you ask my name? And then he blessed him there. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, it is because I saw God face to face, and yet my life was spared. Saw God face to face. So in this place, Jacob wrestles this man, it says. But as we learn, this man is God. He wrestles God. He wrestles with God. And as he's wrestling with God, this is, the next step, right? In the womb, he was wrestling. All through life, he's been wrestling. And he's constantly wrestling. He's been wrestling with God. And he's here wrestling with God. And this is a moment where God isn't his, this is a moment where Jacob's parents' God is no longer, how do I say this? This is where he's not following his parents' God anymore, right? God becomes his God. This is the moment where he's been following his parents' God. He's been going through this and going through the motions and living this life. But in this moment right here, that's all pushed away. And God becomes Jacob's God. And he surrenders and he wrestles with God and he holds on. And there's no longer, what happens is God changes his name. He's no longer, his name is deception. He's not on the heels of other. He's not following Esau, but his name is Israel, which means one who struggles with God. He wrestles with God. And this is what we need to do every day. We wrestle with God. We wrestle with his truth. We hold on. And in this moment, Jacob is holding on to God and he's not letting go. And he asks God to bless him. It's time for change. And he wants this change. And God blesses him. And this is something, Jacob didn't earn this. We have to understand here too that, as Jacob is wrestling with God, God touches in this moment, he touches his hip. And he causes his hip to twitch, and come out of socket, right? And so he touches him, and he has the power. We see the power of God. And so now Jacob has to trust in God. He doesn't have his own strength to fight Esau. He doesn't have his own strength and his own ability to be able to do it. He has to trust in God, and he trusts in him, and he seeks him now. And so Jacob's heart begins to change. And so Jacob isn't perfect, and he won't be after this. And the one that blesses is God. And so even in the womb, God chose Jacob. And we have to understand that Jacob didn't earn this. God chose Jacob. And God used Jacob. And Jacob's going to carry the name of his people. And God picked him to do that. Jacob tells the people to give up all their gods. After this, Jacob tells everybody to give up all the gods. Purify yourselves. This is what he says, okay? So he's made this change. He's done this 180, and he's walking with God, trusting in God. He tells his people, leave your idols behind, lay them down. Then he says, go get clean, purify yourselves. And that's a picture of cleansing. And it's kind of this picture of baptism. You make this change, and you lay down yourself, and you get cleansed. You cleanse yourself. And then he says, put on new clothes. Put on the new self. And we see a picture of this. Paul gives us a picture of this in Ephesians chapter 4, verses 20. Starting at verse 20. It says, that is, however, is not the way of life you learned. You learned. When you heard about Christ and were taught in him in accordance with the truth that is in Jesus. You were taught with regard to your former way of life to put off your old self, which is being corrupted by its deceitful desires. And to be made new in the attitude of your minds. And to put on the new self created to be like God in true righteousness and holiness. Therefore, each of you must put off falsehood and speak truthfully to your neighbor, for we are all members of one body. And so Paul tells us to put off our old selves and to put on the new selves, right? And in this picture, when Jacob is giving orders to his family, he says, leave those idols behind, cleanse yourself, purify yourself, and put on new clothes. We're going to live a new life and on a new journey with God. Genesis 35, 9 through 13. Time's up. Good, because I'm at the end. So Genesis 35, 9 through 13 says this. After Jacob returned from Paddan Aram, God appeared to him again and blessed him. God said to him, your name is Jacob, but you will no longer be called Jacob. Your name will be Israel. So he named him Israel. And God said to him, I am God Almighty. Be fruitful and increase in number. A nation and a community of nations will come from you, and kings will be among your descendants. The land I gave to Abraham and Isaac, I also give to you. And I will give this land to your descendants after you. Then God went up from him at the place where he had talked with him. And so God gives him the same promise that he gave Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so again, God is in control. Even when you are not, God is with us. God is with them. God is with you. And you trust him and you walk with him. And we learn and we grow. Esau, his brother, goes on to be a great nation. The Edomites is the people that are going to come from Esau. And we will see them being at odds with Israel, right? We're going to see them at odds with Israel. Eventually, I thought you were saying, eventually Edomites will become the Idumeans. Does anybody know who the Idumean is, that one of the famous Idumeans is? This tribe is going to change into a different tribe. It's going to change eventually. King Herod, right? Yeah, Herod. So King Herod the Great comes from this. And Herod the Great will be the one who will kill all the kids when Jesus comes to Bethlehem, and he will send and kill all those kids. And so that's where it comes in. Eventually, that family line or that line will disappear. It will go away. So God is with Abraham, God is with Isaac, God is with Jacob, God is with us, and God is with Joseph as well. And then, so we'll jump into Joseph next week in the slavery. But God was with Joseph as well, and we see that in his story, right? If you know his story, God was with him and walked with him through all of that as well. So, all right, let's pray. Father God, thank you for your word and your plan. And Father, help us to trust in that plan. Help us to know that even when you were with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Joseph, and the many men and women of faith in the past, that God, you are with us today, and that you walk with us, and that we believe in the promise that Jesus said in Matthew 28 when he sent the disciples out. Help us to believe in that you are with us always to the ends of the age, Father. That you walk with us and live with us and do life with us, and that you have a plan for us and a purpose for us, and that we are a part of this. And for us to continue to keep our eyes on the prize, help us to keep our eyes on the promised land and the promise that you give us, and that we're a part of building this great nation. God, help us to be used by you and to walk with you and to do life with you and to trust in you and have faith in you. Father, we love you. We praise you. Amen. All right, that's it.